Right then, welcome back to session 2. This is part 2 where we're going to start looking at delivering the project. So we've looked at documentation, we've looked at resource management, and you should have now uploaded your activity for part 1. So we're going to start looking at things like project management tools now. So many tools that we can utilize to help us with the project management through the planning stages, through the execution and control, and through the closure and review. So let's take a look at some of those now. So in the planning stages, we can utilize things such as SWOT, so that's strengths, weakness, opportunities and threats. We'll be using SMART objectives. We'll be using work breakdown structures, WBS, and we'll talk about those. We can use PERT diagrams, and we'll come back to those. Gantt charts. We can be using Plan on a Page, which is a planning tool, and we can be using a Reiki matrix. We can examine some of those in more detail in a bit. We can then be in the execution phase, monitoring those relevant plans, communicating information to stakeholders. We can develop in progress charts based on those things. We can be using our risk log that will have started when we went through the planning and identified the risks, and we can be using action plans. Then in the closure and review stage, we can be reviewing against those plans, and that's why it's key that they're there. We can be holding review meetings to see what people's thoughts was, and we can be using change management control. So some of those we've already talked about. The ones with the green ticks we've already covered. So we looked at SWOT analysis when we went through managing people, and we looked at a personal SWOT when you looked at managing yourself. And then SMART objectives we looked at in 304 for leading people, and we looked at change management control in 308 when we were using when we were looking at operations management. And those things are the same whether it's for a project or for operational management. You're still monitoring those things in the process. So we're not going to focus on those. We'll focus on the others, such as work breakdown structures, PERT diagrams, Gantt charts, planning on a page, etc. as we go through. So let's have a look at some of those tools in a bit more detail. So first, work breakdown structures, and I suppose it says it in the title. Came from system engineering, are useful in project management, and they break things down. They help us break down the sections into smaller things that reach that deliverable for the project. So breaks it into smaller components. Really good at the planning stages for us to get a handle on what's there, and it divides it into manageable sections. And as the Project Management Book of Knowledge, PMBOK, describes it, and hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out. Well, there it is on the screen without me reading it all out. And if that sounds confusing, maybe this visual here of a building project, like an organizational chart of everything that needs to happen, and as in an organizational chart, it's hierarchical as to what needs to happen where, and as you can see in this example, things have been numbered as well. So we go on to this, the build requires across the top line, the site to be prepared, purchasing of stuff, the construction, then the clearing of the site, and then each of those, as we said, broken down into smaller components. So site prep relies on the clearance of the site, the removal of the waste, and the setting out of the site. And then for purchase, we need to estimate the needs, purchase the materials, purchase the tools, take delivery, and so on. That allows people to see each stage and start thinking about who can be doing what and when. So this is why I said it's very good at the planning stage. And to that, people might like to add start and end dates for each activity and or record how much of each activity has been complete. So this could be the background to things that we're going to talk about later on, like progress charts, etc. These steps, and we'll continue to use these steps as we look through the examples. And bringing that all together, we may have some sort of table where we can check our project status by comparing the activity that's actually taken place with the start and end dates and the actual milestones for those planned activities. We see here a table for the first of those activities on there, which was the site prep, which had clear the site as one step, removing the waste as a second, setting out the site. And this has been expanded and now has the person responsible for it, the start date, the actual date it was completed, it actually started, the planned end date, and the actual date it ended, plus any comments. So we've combined the activities and the milestones into this, so we can clearly see where things are and track their progress. Another tool that's also utilised regularly in project management to track progress is a Gantt chart. And we see the example here. We've got the same project. We've got the build. We've got the site prep taking week 1 to 3, the areas that are shaded, and the 3 parts of that phase being clear the site week 1, remove the waste week 2, set out the site week 3, and deliverable on the end of week 3. Next phase, purchasing, due at the end of week 5, but we can see that the deliveries 1.2.4 has been extended, so there's obviously going to be a delay in delivery. And our current position is week 4, and we can see that there's a progress report due. So Gantt charts can be used to map these things out and show things in a visual effect. So they're quite useful for communicating it to everybody about where we're up to, what needs to be done, and where they need to get to. Another technique we can use is PERT diagrams. Used to schedule, organise and coordinate tasks, was originally developed by the US Navy in the 50s to manage Polaris submarines, if that's of any interest. But we can use it in our project management to show a timeline by task, clearly defining a precedence, the order they're going to be done in. This example just highlights that the nodes are the milestones, the numbered bits, and the arrows are the activities and the time in between. And again, we can add our example of the building project to that simple example, and it shows, but they come in many forms. And this is a more complicated one, which not only shows the sort of critical paths that you can use for the PERT diagram and all the stages, but it also shows the start date, as we talked about before, the end date, and the duration, and the person responsible for it. When you have them like this, it's very good for sort of showing which are the critical tasks and which are the non-critical. In other words, which ones can be delayed, which ones don't have interdependencies with other ones, so that we can move resources around, perhaps to catch up on overrunning tasks or things. The disadvantage of it is that, compared to a Gantt chart, does not give such a clear message to people about where progress is and what they've got to get finished and where they are. That's more complicated, so it may not be as clear on focusing people's minds on where things need to be done and how they need to be done. And then we have plan on a page, and it's exactly what it says. It's putting a plan on a page. So on one page, a concise one-page synthesis of the key design elements, I suppose, of the collective impact or approach. So maybe it's used at the initiation planning stages to help get involvement, understanding, to get ideas and focus them. But it is only one page, so what do you include? Well, there's no written rules. There are many different examples for developing a plan on the page. There's some coming up now. Some are very pictorial, some are just written text. But it's about keeping the information simple, accessible, and thinking about telling a collaborative story all on one page so people can see it. So it might be about what you will do, how you will do it, how it will make a difference, the way you will work, and depending on your audience will depend on what you might need to put on there. You may need to have different information depending on the target audience or who you're using it with, but it's a simple and useful process. Not necessarily easy, but that's the whole point. It's about focusing on what's important to get on that one page, but it does help with focus, and there's a bit of extra information on that in the resources. Next, we'll take a look at Reiki Matrix, and that's an acronym really for reviews, approves, creates, and input. It's a simple and effective tool to outline roles and responsibilities, and this can be used right at the beginning to start deciding in the planning stage who will have responsibility for certain areas. And then it can be used through the execution and monitoring stages to keep track of that. So A is about who approves the deliverable. R is reviews that deliverable. C is the person who creates the deliverable, and I would be the person who provides input. And you might also notice, as you can see on the example on the screen, that you do get additions, which is N, that's who needs to be notified a deliverable is complete, and M, about who manages it or who keeps it, who controls it, you could say. So simply put, it's an effective means for defining and knowing who is exactly responsible, who is accountable, who needs to be consulted, and who must be kept informed at every stage. And I suppose looking at an example is the best way to do this. So coming on screen now is simply put, it's a grid or a matrix showing who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, who must be kept informed at every significant step as we go through the project. Enhances the chances of success there and communicating to everybody so that they're aware. So in this simple example matrix, we can see that the project plan is to be created by the manager. Okay, so the project manager is responsible for creating it. The project sponsor has to approve it. The project team are involved in reviewing it. And then the project coordinator is responsible for managing it, so that's keeping it, and therefore N for being notified when certain parts are complete, because if he isn't notified, he can't maintain that project plan. So, simple grid, which sort of will be part of the project plan and will show who's responsible for different parts. So we've explained briefly there a number of tools that we can use throughout the planning and the execution control phases. And some, like Gantt charts and WSB and PERT diagrams, we saw how they could be included for using in progression and monitoring as well. For Gantt charts, we can add timescales and milestones. It can be used by the project manager and the adminer to review and see where we're up to track progress. It can be made accessible to all if we want to give more information and make sure people are aware of where targets are and where the milestones are, and it can be used to inform everybody about progression and to keep everybody on track. WBS and PERT charts, as we saw, if timescales are added, and they're not always, and these can be then linked to the responsibilities from the Reiki matrix, then it can all be used to track the individual tasks because it breaks them down. And if they're all linked together, as we've seen in these examples where they're numbered the same, then they can all be worked together to sort of link everything in and bring it along. And then, of course, we've got to monitor risk log, because as things perhaps slip, this can create a risk that other parts of the project might fall behind, because we can see from the Gantt chart that they're reliant on something being completed. So maintaining and monitoring the risk log as it goes along can be critical as well. But whatever tools we've decided to use, we need to decide if the project has been effective, if the tools have been effective, and that is part of our review and evaluation of the project. So once the project is closed, whether it's completed, by that I mean it's reached its outcomes, or it was stopped because it wasn't going to succeed, and that can happen for many reasons, we still need to conduct a review. Why? Even if it's not achieved, why do we still need to conduct a review? Because we need to confirm what has been achieved from a team perspective and from a project perspective, because the team may have performed well, it might have just been the project has collapsed. We need to tidy up and confirm any leftover resources, so that's a bit about reallocation, reuse, recycling, and just generally cleaning up. And then 3, we need to identify any lessons learned, good and not so good practices that can be identified and analysed, so improvements can be made for the process or for the benefit of any future projects. So overall, it's probably one of the most important stages of the project lifecycle in total, and often referred to as the post-implementation review. It's part of the life cycle, and it's multi-channeled, and it's about all the documentation produced across the project lifecycle, looking back at the original initiation, planning documents and seeing where changes could have been made, any wrong assumptions that were made, and how that's impacted on things going forward. Looking back at risk logs to see if they were anticipated, if those risks turned into issues and materialized, or if they were new ones, or if they were missed, and basically reviewing all the project documentation, which is why it's so important that we have that documentation as we go along, because later on we won't be able to remember perhaps what happened at the beginning, why things have failed, why things have gone wrong, or people will just happily forget them. All this information needs to be captured, and there will probably be some sort of debriefing meeting at the ends for teams, which will bring up significant points. And from the outcome, points will be taken forward to project board meetings, and they will be discussed, and a report will be produced. And that's probably going to form part of the initiation and planning stage of any similar projects, because it should contain any recommendations that can be taken forward so that similar projects can follow the same path, or make sure they don't make the same mistakes, or recommendations just for projects in general. For example, there may be other benefits in there as well that might be useful for future subcontractors, suppliers, clients, so that there can be better advice or information issued, or ultimately make the projects more effective in the long term. And that's what we're looking for, to make sure that the lessons are learned and it makes the next project more successful. Okay, then we've come to the end of part 2, so that's the end of the session. Just a quick recap. Our aim was to know how to deliver a project, and the objectives were to explain the purpose of key project documentation, and we covered that in part 1. The second one was to compare a range of different project management tools and how they can be applied to a project, and we've just been through those. You'll need to pick 3, maybe from the ones we've talked about: Gantt charts, PERT charts, we covered SWOT in the previous session, or research some of your own, but you'll need to do that in the activity. Ask you to compare 3 project management tools. The next was to describe how to manage resources effectively to deliver a project, and we talked in part 1 about allocation, aggregation and scheduling. We've just talked about how to use project management tools to monitor progress, with the timings added to PERT diagrams and using Gantt charts. And then finally, asked you to describe the importance of reviewing project performance, and we've just talked about the importance and why it might be one of the most important parts of the project, and using the documentation that has been produced from what we've done. So let's have a look at the activity you need to do to complete this part before we move on to the next session. Okay, then, as with the other activities, there is a worksheet to download, and if you remember, I said earlier in this unit that there is no end of unit assessment. These activities will be used as part of the assessment for your knowledge for these units. So make sure you take that into account when you're reading them, and make sure you give enough coverage. But 3 parts of the activity. The first is to select at least 3 different project management tools and compare them, and include how they're applied in the project. So whether it's in the planning stages or across the execution and control, and how that might impact on the review. So think about that and the relationships. It might be worth thinking about your project if you've already started it, or planning on what you will use as part of the initiation phase of the project you're going to do. The next part says explain how to use one of these project management tools to monitor progress, ensuring you cover how this can be utilized over a period of time. So 1 and 2 you might want to include together, because as part of using one of those project management tools, you might be explaining how you use it to monitor progress, and then describe the importance of reviewing project performance. So as we just talked about, that end of project implementation review and how important that is. So complete the activity, upload that, remembering this is accessible, so your assessor is going to be deciding whether you've met the criteria using that activity. So make sure it's in enough detail, and that you've fully compared those things, and that you've explained how that tool will be used, and that you've described the importance. If you're not sure, look at the guidance about what describe, explain or compare means, and then once you've completed that and uploaded it, you can move on to session 3.